Every second that ticked by during World War II, the United States was spending millions of dollars. Factories never slept. Soldiers needed weapons, ships had to be built, and secret projects drained resources at levels never seen before. But money wasn't the only cost. Alongside billions of dollars, countless lives were lost, families were torn apart, and the nation's economy was reshaped forever. So here's the big question. Just how much did America really spend to win the war? And more importantly, what does that number mean when we translate it into today's world? When we talk about the cost of World War II, the numbers look impossible. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States government spent around $296 billion on the war effort. That figure alone sounds enormous, but remember, we're talking about 1940s dollars. To put it into perspective, in 1940 the entire U.S. federal budget was less than $10 billion. Overnight, America went from a relatively modest spender to burning through more money in a single year than it had in the previous decade combined. Now, when we translate that $296 billion into today's money, it becomes staggering. Adjusted for inflation, the cost of America's involvement in World War II climbs to over $4 trillion. Some estimates even push it closer to $5 trillion, depending on how you calculate inflation and purchasing power. To give you a comparison, that's more than the entire GDP of countries like Germany or the United Kingdom today. But numbers like trillions can feel abstract. So let's ground it. Imagine lining up dollar bills, just single $1 notes, end to end. If you tried to lay out $4 trillion in dollar bills, the line would stretch far enough to go from Earth to the moon more than 8 times. That's the kind of financial weight America carried to win this war. And the spending wasn't evenly spread across the years. In 1942, the first full year of American involvement, the U.S. spent about $62 billion. By 1944, at the height of the war, that number more than doubled to nearly $100 billion in just 1 year. Another way to see the scale is to look at the share of national wealth. At its peak, about 40% of America's entire gross domestic product went straight into the war effort. Think about that. Almost half of everything the country produced, factories, farms, manpower, was funneled into a single purpose: victory. So, when we ask, how much did the U.S. really spend on World War II? The answer is an economic revolution. In less than 5 years, the United States poured resources on a scale the world had never witnessed before. It was a financial mobilization that permanently changed how America saw its role in the world. When you look at America's war bill, it's a patchwork of costs that touched nearly every corner of society. Every tank rolling off an assembly line, every bomber taking to the skies, every soldier marching onto a battlefield carried a price tag. So, where exactly did all those billions go? The biggest chunk was swallowed by weapons and equipment. In just a few short years, the United States built over 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and more than 70,000 ships of every size, from tiny landing craft to massive aircraft carriers. Each B-17 bomber cost roughly $250,000 in the 1940s, which is around $4.5 million today. Multiply that by the thousands produced, and you start to see how the numbers skyrocketed. Factories that once built cars were retooled to pump out jeeps, rifles, and artillery. Ford's famous Willow Run plant was nicknamed the Bomber Factory because it rolled out one B-24 every 63 minutes. That kind of mass production was unstoppable. Next came the people. More than 16 million Americans served in uniform, and while their paychecks might seem small by today's standards, they added up fast. A private made about $50 a month, plus food and housing. On top of salaries, the government spent enormous sums on uniforms, weapons, medical care, and perhaps most importantly, training. You couldn't just hand someone a rifle and send them to Europe or the Pacific. Months of preparation were needed, and each soldier represented an investment. Then there were the mountains of supplies needed to keep an army moving. Feeding millions of troops required shipping billions of pounds of food across oceans. Armies marched on their stomachs, but also on fuel, boots, tents, and ammunition. A single infantry division could consume up to 700 tons of supplies per day once deployed. Multiply that across hundreds of divisions, and you get a sense of the logistical black hole into which money disappeared. And behind the front lines was the invisible backbone of spending: infrastructure. America had to rapidly expand military bases, training grounds, and shipyards. Entire cities grew around war production hubs. Roads, railroads, and ports were upgraded to handle the massive flow of men and materials. On top of that, factories needed new machinery, workers needed housing, and scientists needed laboratories for projects like radar and jet engines. The United States built the world's largest war machine from scratch. That required money to flow into every detail, from the steel in a battleship's hull to the boots on a young recruit's feet. By the time the war ended, the U.S. had not only armed itself, but also supplied its allies with critical equipment through programs like Lend-Lease. Spending nearly $300 billion in the 1940s wasn't something the U.S. could just pull out of a bank vault. Winning World War II required a creative and at times desperate strategy to keep the money flowing. So how did America actually pay the bill? The most visible answer came in the form of war bonds. Across the country, posters, radio programs, and even Hollywood celebrities begged ordinary Americans to do their part by buying bonds. These bonds were essentially loans from citizens to the government, with the promise of being paid back with interest after the war. And it worked. Families scraped together savings, children donated coins, and workers lined up after payday to purchase bonds. In total, Americans bought more than $185 billion worth of bonds, an extraordinary show of financial patriotism. But war bonds weren't enough on their own. The government also turned to taxes, and in a way Americans had never seen before. Before World War II, only a small fraction of the population paid federal income tax. That changed dramatically. The number of taxpayers jumped from about 4 million in 1939 to over 40 million by the end of the war. Entirely new systems, like payroll withholding, were introduced to make sure taxes were collected efficiently. The message was clear: if you were working, you were helping fund the war. Even with war bonds and higher taxes, the U.S. still needed more. That's where borrowing and national debt came into play. To cover the remaining costs, the government borrowed heavily, pushing national debt from around $50 billion before the war to more than $250 billion by 1945. That means the debt had increased by 500% in just a few short years. Critics worried at the time that this kind of borrowing would ruin the economy, but wartime production actually created a booming job market and lifted America out of the Great Depression. It's important to see how these three elements, bonds, taxes, and borrowing, worked together. Bonds tapped into the emotional drive of patriotism, taxes created a steady flow of revenue, and borrowing filled in the gaps. Without all three, the financial engine of the war might have sputtered. Paying for World War II wasn't painless. Citizens felt it in their wallets, in rationing of goods, and in the long hours they worked in factories. But it also created a sense of unity. Buying a bond or paying taxes was a symbolic act of participation in the war effort. By 1945, America had proven something remarkable: that a democracy could not only mobilize millions of soldiers, but also mobilize millions of wallets. It's one thing to say World War II cost the United States nearly $300 billion in the 1940s, over $4 trillion in today's money. But what really drives home the scale of that spending is putting it side by side with the costs of America's other wars. Let's start with World War I. That conflict was devastating in its own right, but U.S. involvement was shorter and less all-encompassing. By the end of 1918, America had spent about $32 billion on the war effort. In today's money, that comes out to roughly $600 to $700 billion. A staggering number, yes, but still only a fraction of what World War II demanded. In fact, World War II cost the U.S. about 10 times more than World War I. Fast forward to the Vietnam War, a conflict that stretched over 2 decades and consumed enormous resources. Estimates put U.S. spending on Vietnam at around $168 billion in the dollars of the time, about $1 trillion today. Again, massive, but still only about a quarter of the scale of World War II spending. And unlike World War II, where much of the money built permanent infrastructure and reshaped the economy, the Vietnam War left behind far fewer lasting economic benefits. Now let's look at the wars that many of us remember firsthand: Iraq and Afghanistan. These two conflicts, sometimes called the Forever Wars, ran for years and carried ongoing costs in military operations, reconstruction, and veteran care. Combined, estimates put their total price tag at $2 to $3 trillion. That's enough to shock most people, but it still doesn't eclipse World War II. In terms of raw dollars spent, modern conflicts come close. But when you adjust for the size of the economy at the time, World War II still stands as the far heavier burden. Remember, in the 1940s, nearly half of America's GDP went into the war. That's a level of mobilization unmatched by any later conflict. But the scale of World War II spending isn't just about the number of dollars. It's about what those dollars meant. Unlike later wars that often divided public opinion, World War II united the nation. People were convinced they were fighting for survival, and that sense of urgency justified the astronomical sums being poured into the war machine. When historians call World War II the most expensive war in American history, they're not exaggerating. By every measure, money, manpower, and resources, it was a conflict on a scale the country has never seen before and likely never will again. If World War II was the most expensive war in American history, it was also the one that reshaped the U.S. economy more than any other. The money spent on the war rebuilt America at home in ways that would define the nation for generations. First, it's important to remember the starting point. In 1940, the United States was still struggling through the Great Depression. Unemployment hovered around 15%, and millions of families were scraping by with very little. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs had offered some relief, but the economy remained sluggish. Then came the war. The massive wave of spending to prepare for and fight effectively ended the Depression overnight. Factories that had been sitting idle suddenly roared back to life. Entire industries were repurposed. Auto companies like Ford and General Motors stopped producing cars and started churning out tanks, planes, and jeeps. The need for labor skyrocketed, and unemployment plummeted to record lows. For the first time in a decade, Americans had steady paychecks and steady work. This transformation earned the United States the title of the Arsenal of Democracy. Roosevelt used that phrase in 1940, promising that America would supply the weapons needed to fight tyranny even before it formally entered the war. And that's exactly what happened. Billions of dollars went into arming U.S. troops and also into sending tanks, planes, and supplies to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies. American factories became the beating heart of the Allied war machine, and they ran 24/7 to meet the demand. Between 1940 and 1945, U.S. industrial output more than doubled. The aircraft industry alone exploded from producing a few thousand planes a year to rolling out tens of thousands. Shipyards launched entire fleets of Liberty ships, sometimes completing one in less than a week. The sheer scale of production was unlike anything the world had ever seen, but perhaps the most profound impact was on employment. Millions of men went overseas to fight, and millions of new jobs opened up at home. That meant women and minorities entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter symbolized women stepping into roles once reserved for men, building planes, welding ships, and running heavy machinery. African Americans also found new opportunities in war industries, laying the groundwork for future civil rights struggles. War spending created jobs and prosperity. Wages rose, savings increased, and ordinary Americans who had lived through years of hardship finally had money in their pockets. Of course, rationing meant they couldn't spend freely on luxuries, but the sense of stability and hope was undeniable. By the war's end, America had reinvented its economy at home. The Great Depression was gone, replaced by an industrial superpower ready to dominate the global economy for decades. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, America's wartime spending spree didn't simply vanish. The financial aftershocks of World War II rippled through the U.S. economy for decades, quietly shaping budgets, policies, and even America's role in the world. If the war was expensive to fight, it was just as expensive to live with afterward. One of the largest long-term expenses was veteran care and pensions. More than 16 million Americans had served in the armed forces, and they didn't just walk away when the war ended. Many needed medical treatment for physical injuries, psychological trauma, or long-term disabilities. The government also promised pensions and benefits to millions of returning servicemen. In 1944, the GI Bill was introduced, offering veterans money for education, housing, and training. It was one of the most ambitious social programs in U.S. history, and while it paid off by creating a better educated, more prosperous middle class, it carried a hefty price tag. For decades, billions flowed every year into veteran services, a financial commitment that never truly ended. Then there was the interest on war debt. Remember the borrowing spree that pushed national debt from $50 billion to over $250 billion by 1945? That money had to be repaid, and interest didn't disappear. For years after the war, a significant chunk of the federal budget went not to new programs or investments, but simply to covering the cost of yesterday's war. In some years, as much as 40% of the budget was devoted to debt payments. The bill for World War II stretched across generations, quietly pulling resources away from other needs. And yet, not all of the long-term costs were burdens. Some were lasting infrastructure and global commitments that reshaped the country in powerful ways. The factories, research labs, and transport networks built during the war became the backbone of post-war prosperity. Highways, shipyards, and airports, all expanded or modernized during wartime, helped fuel decades of economic growth. But those commitments also pulled America outward, locking it into a global role. The Marshall Plan, NATO, and military bases around the world weren't free. The decision to maintain a permanent military presence abroad meant America stayed on a kind of wartime footing, even in peacetime. Defense budgets remained high, foreign aid programs expanded, and the United States found itself permanently responsible for maintaining order in a volatile world. So, while the headline number, $296 billion in the 1940s, trillions today, captures the immediate cost of fighting World War II, the true price was spread across decades. From caring for veterans to servicing debt, from maintaining bases overseas to fueling the Cold War, America's financial obligations didn't end with victory. They simply changed shape. Winning the war was expensive, but paying for the peace was, in its own way, just as costly. But here's a harder question. Was it worth it? America's bill was staggering, both in money and in lives, but it also transformed the nation in ways no one could have imagined in 1941. The first part of the legacy is clear. Spending reshaped America's role as a superpower. Before the war, the United States had been a powerful country, but still somewhat hesitant to take center stage on the world stage. After the war, there was no hesitation. The vast industrial machine built with wartime spending pivoted. Factories that had produced tanks and planes switched back to cars and appliances. Scientific research from wartime projects gave birth to breakthroughs in medicine, aviation, and eventually the space race. By 1945, the U.S. was the wealthiest, most technologically advanced, and most militarily powerful nation on Earth. While Europe and Asia lay in ruins, American cities buzzed with growth. That wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of a government willing to pour trillions into a fight for survival, and in the process, reinvent its economy. But that raises the more complicated part of the question. What about the cost versus the outcome? $4 trillion in today's terms is a price almost beyond comprehension. Could it have been avoided? Probably not. Once Pearl Harbor was attacked, the war was inevitable, and survival was non-negotiable. The alternative, allowing Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan to dominate the world, was unthinkable. Compared to that, the financial sacrifice seems not only justified, but necessary. The massive national debt, the long-term care for veterans, and America's permanent global commitments all trace back to the wartime spending spree. And while it secured victory, it also locked the United States into a role of global policeman, a responsibility that has been both a source of pride and controversy ever since. Perhaps the best way to understand the legacy is this: World War II spending was the ultimate gamble. America wagered everything, its treasure, its economy, even its stability, on the belief that victory was worth any price. And the gamble paid off. The United States emerged as a superpower whose influence would shape the second half of the 20th century. So, Was it worth the price? For the Americans who lived through the Depression, saw their sons march off to war, and then watched their country rise to global leadership, the answer was yes. The war was costly, astronomically so, but it was also the foundation of modern America. Without that spending, the world we know today would look very different. When we step back and look at the numbers, they are almost too big to grasp. Nearly $300 billion in 1940s dollars, the equivalent of over $4 trillion today, was poured into America's fight in World War II. Trillions of dollars for weapons, for ships, for planes, for soldiers' paychecks, for research, and for the infrastructure needed to sustain the greatest war machine the world has ever seen. But the true cost of World War II was the debt carried for decades, the veterans who needed care long after the war ended, and the permanent commitments America made on the global stage. It was also measured in lives, over 400,000 Americans who never returned home, and millions more who carried the scars of war with them for the rest of their lives. And yet, that spending ended the Great Depression, fueled an industrial revolution, and propelled the United States into its role as a global superpower. So when we ask, how much did America really spend on World War II? The answer is the story of a nation that put nearly everything it had on the line, and in doing so, changed both itself and the world forever.